Welcome back to this discussion on the notion of the classical. In the previous episode, we discussed Horace and his understanding of form or order. And the Horatian view is that the form that we use, the literary form, is a reflection of the social order in which we live. And in that sense, a disordered society cannot produce serious literature because it does not have those kinds of forms that are important to reflect order. Swati, you have any doubts?
When there is no order, like maybe in a state of anarchy, don't we have like more experiments coming up, like which maybe we don't have like literature in the traditional sense, but aren't more innovations coming up from a disorderly state?
You're right. Disorderly states are provocative in that sense, especially for creative people, and they tend to bring out more experimental writing, and some of its writing is definitely universal and international in that sense, and very great too. The only problem I have with that is because the argument is one of resistance and it does not throw light on what people are exactly in a more normal state. But of course, you can always ask the question, like, what is really normal? What is a normal state like? Have people ever existed without conflicts? I accept, never. We don't know what that state is. And some divisions and some differences have always been at the heart of human societies. But my point is that, like when we talk about the Elizabethan age, that semblance of peace is there. Because at the end of the day, just as much as we have those conflicts which are emotional or spiritual, we also need the space to explore those concepts. But it does not mean at all, that where there are conflicts, people don't become creative in a larger sense. They do, they absolutely do. However, I see a slight difference, that when you think of examples of revolutionary poets, like Pasolini, for example, who are brilliant when it comes to talking about human feelings, and there is a weight of dissatisfaction. So in that sense, I would say order and form go together. Somehow I take Horace's argument that for form to flourish, we need an ordered society. And one is not independent of the other. They go together. But when we come down to Longinus, who probably lived somewhere between the 1st or 3rd century AD, the dates are not clear. Unlike Horace, in whom we see that the poet has a social function of responding to his audience. The social is not an individual. The poet is not an individual. He's a social being. In On Sublimity by Longinus, we are struck by the individuality of the text in its emphasis on the relationship between literary genius and greatness. This is the relationship that Longinus makes, that literary genius and greatness are connected, they're not independent. Sublimity is a metaphor that connects both of them. And this is in quotes. Sublimity is a kind of eminence or excellence of discourse. It is the source of the distinction of the very greatest poets and prose writers and the means by which they have given eternal life to their own fame. So sublimity is vital, for us to understand what literary art is all about. The greatness, however, does not rest on vacuum. It rests on the ability of genius to make comparisons. So genius is the ability to connect. What did Eliot say in his essay on the metaphysical poets? You see, it's not just reading Spinoza, it's not just falling in love. If you are able to read Spinoza and connect it with falling in love, that's when you're a poet. You see? But if you cannot see the connection between reading Spinoza and falling in love, you cannot be a poet. You see? That connection is vital. You see? But Spinoza himself is not, there's nothing about love in Spinoza as such. You see? It is just his transcendental kind of philosopher. And this philosopher who explored this whole idea of the intellectual love of God and who believed in a life of a philosopher who is dedicated to very simple things. So that kind of a philosopher Spinoza is. But somewhere there is a poet in Spinoza that makes him who he is. Bertrand Russell says in the History of Western Philosophy, that Spinoza is the most lovable of great philosophers. But that lovableness of Spinoza comes from his philosophy, which he lived. Others spoke about philosophy, but Spinoza lived it. So his sublimity comes from that, and his greatness. And therefore, Eliot thinks it's important that when you fall in love, you think of Spinoza. You see, it's an extended comparison that Eliot makes, but it makes sense. So that kind of comparison, I mean, you can think of who is a poet or what is poetry all about. You see, that again, Bertrand Russell in the History of Western Philosophy, you see, he says Saint Francis of Assisi. You see, he says he has the love of a poet in him. You see. But what Russell says is that there is nothing that Saint Francis could not love. You see. There is nothing who he thought was not, did not deserve that kind of boundless affection. You see. And he praises him as a great saint. You see. But Saint Francis never wrote poetry. You see, the idea is extending the metaphor, you see, to what is a poet. If Spinoza is a poet or if Saint Francis is a poet, you see, it is just that sublimity that makes them who they are. You see. That's what the sublime is all about. You see. The greatness, however, does not rest on vacuum. It rests on the ability of genius to make that comparison. To see Spinoza as a poet or to see Saint Francis as a poet, that is the genius of Bertrand Russell. He can make that comparison. You see. Take an example that Longinus gives. In praise of Alexander the Great, Timaeus writes, he conquered all Asia in fewer years than it took Isocrates to write the Panegyricus to advocate the Persian war. What a splendid comparison this is, the Macedonian king and the sophist. In his Life of Cowley, Dr. Johnson famously said of the metaphysical poets that in their work, this is Johnson, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, close quote. The comparison that Timaeus makes in bringing Alexander's conquest of Asia and Isocrates writing the Panegyricus carries this sense of being yoked with an irony that disguises the violence. The conqueror and poet, most heterogeneous ideas, are brought together in the same statement because both are achievements that demand enormous abilities. One is to conquer Asia, another is to write the Panegyricus. But by making that comparison, he creates that sublime metaphor. But that, you see, that sublimity is not merely a metaphor. It's also the person. It's Alexander. It's none other than Alexander. Greatness, as experienced in the form of sublimity, is as much a moral and a psychological trait as it is intellectual and philosophical. A literary artist is also a moralist. In his essay, The Artist's Struggle with Integrity, James Baldwin, the black writer, says that an artist must be true to the person that he or she is. You cannot be creative for money or fame or power. You can be creative only when you have the ability to disdain these things, says Baldwin. This is Baldwin. The poets, by which I mean the artists, are the only ones who know the truth about us. Very different from what Plato thinks about poets. Soldiers don't, statesmen don't, union leaders don't. Only artists can tell. Only artists have told what it is like to die, what it is like to feel, what it is like to love. The aesthetic, how we define the beautiful, and the moral, how we live our lives, go together for sublimity to be possible in the highest sense of the term. You see, this is the whole debate about art and life. Whether art is greater than life or life is greater than art, or can we have life without art, or can an artist ignore what life is all about? These questions are asked in different forms, like art for art's sake, life for life's sake, whatever. But where it comes to Longinus, the answer is pretty clear. That An unethical life cannot produce great literary art. You see, both are connected. The sublimity of the life has to be reflected in art. You see. If Spinoza is a great philosopher, it's because of the life that he lived. You see. The great philosophy is what he lived. You see. Though he wrote very little. He wrote one book, I think, Ethics, which is not a very long book. You see. So the poet is both a stylist as well as a moralist. True sublimity is about achieving perfection of the self in terms of the integrity that Baldwin speaks of, as much as it is achieving that integrity in the work of art itself. You see. And this is again Longinus. You see. People who could have these advantages, wealth, honor, power, if they chose, but disdain them out of magnanimity, are admired much more than those who actually possess them. It is much the same with elevation in poetry and literature generally. We have to ask ourselves whether any particular example does not give a show of grandeur, which for all its accidental trappings will, when dissected, prove vain and hollow, the kind of thing which it does a man more honor to despise than to admire. It is our nature to be elevated and exalted by true sublimity. Filled with joy and pride, we come to believe we have created what we have only heard. You see. My point is again, my question to you, do you think it makes sense, is it fair to connect somebody's literary greatness to how he or she lives? You see? After all, you can be very creative and you can live a terrible life, you see. So why not, you see? Is it possible or not, Or what are the problems with what Longinus says,
This is an interesting view because obviously the persona or how the persona is lived out, established in reality should have an effect, but to a greater extent, isn't it slightly limited? I mean, we can't completely conform only to this.
I think George Orwell, when he wrote an essay on Salvador Dali, he wrote that if a Holocaust is hiding behind a canvas, maybe we should not allow it. But how far can we take Dali's life as it is and connect it with his paintings? I think art and the life of the artist should be kept separate. Otherwise, we'll be reading things that that the artist has lived into his art, which will make it very limited. I feel it there.
I completely agree with you, because the point is that human life is a complex one, and human motives are complex too, you see. But creativity is, can be an end in itself, you see. Or to be productive or to be a genius may also reflect, take an artist like Dostoevsky, whose life was a very turbulent one, you see. But when you think of the kind of books that he wrote, transformative, and an absolutely penetrating understanding of the human soul, you see. So is it fair to say that Dostoevsky was not a good writer because he gambled and he threw away all his money in gambling, and he was an addict, and he was self-destructive, and he was a masochist, and there's nothing great in him in that sense. The greatness is that he endured that kind of deviance, and that he brings it out in a powerful way in his narrative, in his writing. I don't know, probably I would assume that Longinus's understanding of greatness is not in the monolithic sense. Like individual greatness is not merely that you wake up at 5 in the morning and start jogging, or you go to bed at 9 o'clock, you see. It's not that, that's not really greatness, you see. That's pretty banal, or commonplace, you see. You see, definitely a writer would like Dostoevsky, you see. Whose life is a strange one, whose life itself is more like a work of art, does have that greatness that kind of greatness is reflected in his work as well. And surely, in that sense, he is sublime. Longinus brings together in the above quote, the magnanimity of those who do not care for wealth and elevation in poetry. Further down he says, in literature, nature occupies the place of good fortune and art that of good counsel. Most important of all, the very fact that some things in literature depend on nature alone can itself be learned from art. So you see, at the end of the day, Longinus can see that we can only see life through art. It cannot be other way, any other way around, you see. I mean, only life can imitate art, you see. Art will only reflect life. Art will not imitate life, never, you see. It reconstructs life. You see. I mean, an artist never tries to give us a mirror image of reality, never. He'll always shape it or reshape it or transform it, before putting it on paper. Most important of all, the very fact that some things in literature depend on nature alone can itself be learned only from art. You see, that even what our dependence on nature, we only learn it through art, you see, or through language. You see. Sublimity is a literary technique that leads one to elevation. That's how I interpret it. Sublimity is not just sublimity. You see, it's also a literary technique. You see. For instance, the Persian poet Hafiz says in one of his ghazals, if that Shirazi Turk would take my heart in her hand, for the dark mole on her cheek, I would give Samarkand and Bukhara and add thereto even my body and my soul. The dark mole is certainly without a price for Hafiz. But if at all it has to be valued, Hafiz would not only give Samarkand and Bukhara, the two famed cities on the Central Asian Silk Route, but add thereto even my body and my soul. You see. See the comparison, it's such an extended comparison. You see. For one mole, you would give away two cities. You see. Because the former, Samarkand was also the capital of Timur the Lame's empire. The thought is a sublime one, the fact that a person can give everything he possesses for a dark mole on the cheek of the beloved. That's what makes the expression a sublime one as well. But Hafiz is saying, I'll give both the cities and everything, including my body and my soul. A sublime thought cannot but have a sublime expression. Sublime thoughts are rooted in a moral sensibility. The beauty of the dark mole has awakened the moral sensibility in the poet and elevated him to utter lines with grandeur, so much so that legend says that Timur the Lame, he complained to Hafiz, with the blows of my lustrous sword, I have subjugated most of the habitable globe to embellish Samarkand and Bukhara, the seats of my government, and you miserable wretch would sell them for the black mole of a Turk of Shiraz. That's what Hafiz is saying, that's what Timur is telling Hafiz. And Hafiz, not without some irony, responded, alas, O prince, it is this prodigality which is the cause of the misery in which you find me. I mean, it's a response that fortunately pleased Timur, Otherwise he could have been executed, You see that poets can give anything, but because it's not theirs, because it's not theirs, they can give, So the sublimity and what is not so sublime, I guess they go together, So the sublime is not a discourse that happens through pure inspiration, While competence in speaking is assumed as a common foundation for all, in quotes, the most important sources of sublime are great thoughts, inspired emotion, both of which are natural, certain kinds of figures of thought in speech, noble diction, and dignified word arrangement. One of the ways of achieving sublimity is by conscious imitation of the great writers of the past. This is again quotes. When we are working on something which needs loftiness of expression and greatness of thought, it is good to imagine how Homer would have said the same thing, or how Plato or Demosthenes or in history Thucydides would have invested it with sublimity. These great figures presented to us as objects of emulation and as it were shining before our gaze will somehow elevate our minds to the greatness of which we form a mental image, close quote. So sublimity of style is not just happening through inspiration, it's also through a learning. It happens through understanding of what the great writers of the past did. Therefore, imitation in itself is not to be looked down upon as an artistic failure in terms of a lack of originality. So he doesn't think imitation is a bad thing, he sees it as a positive thing. Earlier in the same essay on the Sublime, Longinus points out that, quote, lapses from dignity arise in literature through a single cause, that desire for novelty of thought, which is all the rage today, in quotes. You see. He's complaining about this desire for novelty. I wonder what he would have said of the 20th century, where novelty is the issue. The attempt to be original does not always lead one to the sublime. Very important. That merely being original does not mean you're sublime. They are completely different things. On the contrary, it would be a frivolous end in itself, serving no higher purpose as such. Merely going after something original does not make you sublime. At the same time, Longinus wisely observes that genius takes risks that mediocrity cannot. He asks himself the question, what then was the vision which inspired those divine writers who disdained exactness of detail and aimed at greatest prizes in literature? It may not always be possible to find a straight answer to the question, but Longinus asserts confidently that, in quotes, freedom from error does indeed save us from blame, but it is only greatness that wins admiration. So Longinus does accept, without error, a static life, a life without experiment, or a life which does not think in terms of difference, cannot be productive, cannot be creative. Something of that life has to be reflected in your art. So your ability to make mistakes, is also your ability to be a genius. If you cannot make the mistake, you will end up being mediocre. So it's not a simple view of the sublime that Longinus takes. So in that sense, Horace and Longinus, they take the notion of classical to an entirely different level from when we compare them to Plato and Aristotle. My view is that in Plato and Aristotle, it's more universal and more philosophical. It's constantly trying to understand life in terms of higher goals or higher ideas. But when we come to Horace and Longinus, it's more at the practical level and actually at the level of writing. That's where their importance lies. Can the sublime in thought and expression be achieved through imitation? Because look, we look down upon imitation seriously in the 21st century, right? So do you agree with Longinus' idea that it's possible to be sublime through imitation? So can you write like Shakespeare and still be sublime? Is imitation a good thing or a bad thing?
Even when we try to imitate Shakespeare, there's some element of you and your thoughts that is getting that's coming out. So it's possible to be sublime in that sense. It's just that you're sticking to the form, but you can't be totally like what Shakespeare was when he wrote, because that individual element also comes in, right?
Certainly, imitation can be a source of the sublime. And as you said, all imitation, there is an element of translation, and your thoughts are dramatized in the process. So imitation cannot be pure imitation. It has to be something more than that. Or what I always say is that imitation is reconstruction. But why is imitation looked down upon?
Again, when we try to understand the prejudice against imitation, most probably it comes from the very idea that, or the very 21st century idea that one has to be original, quite contrary to what Longinus says, that the attempt to be original doesn't essentially make you sublime. These are very polarized ideas, aren't they? What is it that is being imitated? As in, when one is looking at Shakespeare, for instance, is one considering Shakespeare's language or Shakespeare's way of articulating his characters, or is one trying to identify with the basic philosophy or thinking of Shakespeare and trying to recreate that or reconstruct that in a slightly different context? Again, which part of the form or which part of the content are we imitating really? How are we reacting to it? So it's interesting to see how intertextuality works, how we can immediately connect some book to some other book, whether it's predecessor or following it. And I don't know how much the word imitation can be applied there, more like certain essences of the books are very essentially similar. And at the end of the day, all of us somewhere try to believe in reference to context. We always try to relate something to something else.
Very true.
So how can we really look at the concept of imitation if we are already trying to connect or reconnect ideas is, again, I guess, a very interesting ground study to go in.
Very true. Because my personal view is that, I mean, to some extent, I'm sure that Longinus is on the Sublime goes with that. Because artists, I mean, no matter how much we attribute individuality or greatness to one person or to a name, it's still we are talking about a function. I mean, they don't have to be original in the sense of being the origin of all things, seen and unseen. By that argument, imitation is a legitimate strategy of writing poetry, or of writing itself. But at the same time, you see that he doesn't hesitate to say that you have to have your own character. You have to be willing to take those risks that will make you more and more creative. You have to make those mistakes that will enable you to grow. So you cannot evolve just like that. If you are afraid to make those mistakes, that will give you the opportunity to be sublime. And that applies both to life as well as art. Look, at the end of this discussion on classical criticism, one thing we can be sure of is that the word classical is not something that can easily be defined. The struggle with language is there, the struggle with oneself is there, the struggle with the past is there, the struggle with the future is there, just as there is a struggle with the present as well. And all of this comes out in the struggle to define the classical. While we say that, broadly speaking, we identify the classical with order or form or some kind of unity and harmony. Something, I mean, values or ideas that also throw light on much of the writing in the 21st century. Thank you very much.